Warm summer greetings to you all. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your location. Welcome to today's MAI webinar. This is Ramon Rocha of Media Associates International, or MAI. Special welcome to friends from the ECPA family and to those of you who have joined an MAI webinar for the first time. Welcome. And we are glad to see 85 from 26 countries who have signed up for this webinar. I'll just mention 5 countries representing 5 different regions. Czech Republic in Europe, Burkina Faso in Africa, Myanmar in Asia, New Zealand in the Oceania region, and Panama in the Central and South America. Thank you all for being here. Jeff, I'll formally introduce you, but I'll ask you now to please greet our friends who have joined us live today.
Yes, well, as Ramon said, we're glad you're here. Welcome from ECPA. So good to be with you, with other people doing good publishing work throughout the world. I am thankful that you've joined us.
Thank you, Jeff. MAI is a training agency founded in 1985, whose mission is to equip and encourage global Christian writers and publishers to create life-transforming materials in their heart language and in their local context, that these publications will help strengthen the church and impact society. Well, just a reminder on our webinar house rule. I'm sorry that the chat is disabled, and we can only use the Q&A for both your comments and your questions. We will have the Q&A after the presentation. The title of today's webinar is Pursuing Along Obedience in the Same Direction, Exercising Intentionality in Staying Fresh, Relevant, and Effective as a Publisher. The Christian publisher's job is a high-pressure one. You're leading a team that constantly seeks to publish titles that will further your company's mission and vision. And at the same time, you're hoping that these titles will help you generate enough revenues to cover all of your operating costs and be financially sustainable. The role is for sure demanding, very stressful, overwhelming at times, and it could be lonely too. To address this vital topic is Jeff Crosby. Jeff has 39 years experience in the Christian book industry in North America. He has taken on challenging roles in retailing, wholesale distribution, and in January of 1998, joined InterVarsity Press USA, where he served in several executive capacities. Jeff served as IVP USS publisher from 2016 to 2021. Currently, he is president and CEO of Evangelical Christian Publishers Association, or ECPA, with members not only in North America, but worldwide as well. He's also the author of the forthcoming broadleaf books entitled The Language of the Soul, which will be published next spring. Jeff was also a plenary and workshop leader at MAI's Lit World 2018 Global Publishing Conference in Singapore. So Jeff, we are so privileged to have you as our resource presenter today. Please take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Ramon and John and the MAI team for inviting me to share this webinar, which I had planned to do at Lit World in Hungary this spring. I was unable to be there, but I'm thankful to be able to share these remarks with the community now. What I hope to do is spend about 30 minutes offering reflections born out of my leadership journey, and then leave the rest of the time for dialogue at the end, which Ramon will moderate. I hope you'll feel free as we enter the dialogue portion to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll engage around the questions or the feedback that you have about what you've heard. I have found that the most helpful content in sessions like these is often what happens in the dialogue we can have with one another. My context, as Ramon said, is decidedly North America, but with great interest in and affection for what is happening in other parts of the world. For the first 19 of my 24 years at InterVarsity Press, USA, I served as the head of the sales and marketing department. And in that capacity, part of my responsibility was caring for international sales work and the distribution partnerships that we established. Through that, I met remarkable people doing significant ministry with Christian literature throughout the world, some of whom are joining us today, either live or through the video recording. I'm privileged to serve as an honorary advisor to the John Stott literary executors, which, when coupled with the IVP work and previous connections to Langham, has given me a window into the publishing going on in geographic locations that I've rarely, if ever, been to. But even with that background, my lens is decidedly North American for understanding the question, how does one exercise intentionality in staying fresh, relevant, and effective as a Christian publisher? It's through these 39 years of work as a bookstore owner, work with Ingram Book Distribution and IVP in North America. It's my prayer that those of you joining us from Africa, from South America, from Asia, Eastern and Western Europe, and other parts of the world will nonetheless find something of value in what I share today, and that you can contextualize my remarks for your environment, for your unique challenges, and for your opportunities. One of the books that drew me to work with IVP many years ago was Eugene Peterson's A Long Obedience in the Same Direction, a book that expounded powerfully on the Psalms of Ascent, Psalms 120 through 134. These Psalms, Peterson said, forged a manual for discipleship. The book was originally published just before my wife and I reopened a Lagos bookstore near a large research university campus, where InterVarsity's student ministry was active, and where Peterson's book indeed became a tool of discipleship for multiple generations. In words written about a long obedience included in his later book, Take and Read, Peterson declared that he was motivated to write A Long Obedience to counter the American lust for easy answers and quick solutions by submitting to these old prayers that were used on the road as pilgrims worked their way up through the hills to the great acts of worship in Jerusalem. In what I share today, I'm mindful of Peterson's words and the propensity people in my own country have for trying to find easy answers and quick solutions. As we seek to exercise intentionality in staying fresh, relevant, and effective in this work, please hear me as we begin. This is not easy. It's hard work. There are no quick solutions. There aren't 10 keys that are sure to work or 7 habits that ensure success. And I most certainly have had seasons of ineffectiveness and discouragement, of asking myself if what I was doing had any relevance at all for the world. But I have found that there is a constellation of behaviors or practices that are critical to pursue individually and corporately if we are to have hope of achieving the ideal of staying fresh, of staying relevant, and of being effective over the long haul. And I will share those with you today by boiling 20 down to 3 overarching themes for your consideration. You may have already seen the list through the handout that I asked Ramon to send you ahead of time. I want to start, however, with something even more foundational to the constellation of practices, And that is a bedrock understanding of what we most urgently need in order to flourish in our work as Christian publishers, and to whom we must consistently be looking. That bedrock mindset is depicted in this graphic on your screen. It's contained in a Bethany House book written by Peter Greer and Chris Horst. It's titled The Gift of Disillusionment, Enduring Hope for Leaders After Idealism Fades, which ties directly into the themes of long obedience in this webinar. The entire book is built around the graphic I've used here with the permission of the Baker Publishing Group. I remember when I first saw this book last winter, and its title, The Gift of Disillusionment, it captured my attention because it seemed so paradoxical. Being disillusioned is not often seen as a gift, is it? We become disillusioned with friends and with family members. We become disillusioned with our governmental officials and their policies. We become disillusioned with the church sometimes. We become disillusioned with Amazon.com or other major customers who may be challenging to work with. We are, at times, if we're honest, have seasons of disillusionment with our work. Is that really a gift? And yet the subtitle of the book drew me in, Enduring Hope After Idealism Fades. And so I began a dialogue with one of the co-authors, Peter Greer, whose previous book, 40/40 Vision, I had published at IVP. And I read a copy of their new book this spring. Greer will be leading a session at the May 2023 ECPA Leadership Summit in Nashville, born out of the content of this book, which is rooted in the biblical book of Jeremiah, and also stories of enduring hope among leaders and people in places like the Philippines, Lebanon, India, America, Zambia, Guatemala, and other parts of the world. The author suggests that for most of us, our work and our leadership begins with some measure of idealism. It's the nature of starting something new. I know that was true for me even a year ago as I began this new work as ECPA's president, and I suspect that you've seen this in your own life and work as well. We have unrealistic and imaginative visions of the future, perhaps a false hope of guaranteed success. I remember when I was interviewed for the InterVarsity Press sales and marketing role in 1997 by IVP's editorial director at the time, Andy Lepeau, I presented a grand vision for how the company's work with Christian bookstores in the United States could be strengthened, could be expanded, could be made much more effective after the company had experienced several years of decline with that market segment in the mid to late 1990s. I remember Andy looked at me over our dinner table and he said, quote, "Well, I guess if anyone should have an idealistic view of that market segment, it would be the sales and marketing director." I had an imaginative vision for IVP's future, especially with the type of bookstores that I had run for so many years. The type of store where Eugene Peterson's A Long Obedience or Run with the Horses was stacked up in large quantities and sold to many, many people. It wasn't long before I hit a turning point though, and I'm not alone. At some point in our work, sometimes quickly, sometimes a bit later, we have a turning point when reality clashes with our expectations. This is what the authors call disillusionment, or a faint hope. And it's at that time that we have a choice to make. Do we turn inward or do we turn upward? To turn inward drives us towards cynicism, or what the authors suggest is disbelief that positive change for ourselves, our organization, our world is possible. To turn upward drives us toward enduring hope, a complete trust, and an active expectation in God's redemptive work in us, in our work, in our companies, and in our world. My turning point regarding the future of bookstores and IVP's work with them could have driven me to cynicism about my future. After all, I had all this background and experience with stores like that, and I was bringing the vision to IVP, and it wasn't working. It could have driven me to cynicism about my future or about the company's future, but it didn't. I had confidence that God cared about the work of that company, about that company's impact. And I had confidence that our team would be led by God in new directions that would enable us to carry forward the mission that had begun in 1947. And we were led, and the company continued to grow, continued to have an impact, and it is doing so to this day. People who exercise intentionality in staying fresh, relevant, and effective as a Christian publisher are those who are committed to turn upward, to live and work out of a bedrock assurance of God's redemptive work. But the journey along this continuum is not usually one way. Sometimes we hit seasons in our work where we are led back to a choice. Do we turn inward again in the midst of suffering, in the midst of challenge? Or do we remember the God we serve? Do we remember the God who is there and who cares for this work? And do we turn back upward toward enduring hope? In these nearly 4 decades of work in the realm of bookselling, distribution, and publishing, I've experienced several occasions where I came to that kind of turning point. And it was the practices that I'll share with you in a moment that redirected me upward, outward, and onward in discernment, in a long obedience, in perseverance, in community. Greer and Horst in their book wisely write that grit and resilience flow from our rootedness in the God of hope. They are the fruit, not the root. Let me say that again. Grit and resilience flow from our rootedness in the God of hope. They are the fruit, not the root. As I reflected in the months leading up to Hungary and now to this webinar, as I was putting my remarks together, I thought about the practices that have enabled me and enabled other leaders and companies that I admire, some of whom have joined us today, enabled us to exercise intentionality in the way that we're discussing. I arrived at 20 common markers, common characteristics of those leaders and companies. 10 of the markers are connected more to the leader, or what I say here is personal. And the other 10 are connected more to the company or to the corporation. I call the personal elements practices and postures and permissions. And the corporate list is conventions and commitments and the culture of a given company. You have them on your handout, but they're listed on the screen now. And I'll go through each of these briefly and then want to link them to 3 emerging, what at least for me emerged as overarching themes. First, for the leader, understand your calling. It's important that you understand this and that you remind yourself of it regularly throughout your career. What brought you to this work? What motivates you in it? What do you hope to achieve? I love what the author Robert Benson wrote in his book, Between the Dream and the Coming True, when he said, how do we come to choose what it is that we spend our days doing? Would we choose it again if we could? Did we choose it today, or has it simply carried us along somehow? Benson's words, which I first read 2 decades ago, are ones that I've carried with me in turning point moments and in times of vocational discernment. Second, for the leader, read and read widely. This should go without saying to a group of publishers and publishing professionals, but I'm surprised by how often I hear people in our line of work saying, I simply don't have time to read. It's absolutely essential, I believe, for us to read and to read widely and deeply if we're to remain fresh, relevant, and effective in this work. Third, for the leader, check your biases, your blind spots. We all have them, but a leader who is effective over the long haul has a heightened level of self-awareness and attempts to check biases, allowing herself to be shown that there is a different way to view a given issue, allowing himself to be open to new ideas about how work is done, about what opportunities are seized or are neglected, what prior ways of doing business should be set aside, what new generations of workers can offer the company. Fourth, commit to your own professional development. Leaders who thrive, who stay fresh and relevant and effective, are always learning, always growing, always stretching themselves in new directions. One of the things I most appreciate about MAI's work and John's and Ramon's work is the way that the organization is helping to train and equip and encourage publishing partners all around the world. So commit to your development, continue to be a lifelong learner. Fifth, nurture your spiritual growth as a person who carries the imago Dei, the image of Christ, into your work. As Ruth Haley Barton, another author I worked with, has said, the greatest gift we as leaders can bring to our companies and our teams is our transformed self. So commit to your own spiritual growth in the midst of the challenging work and the sometimes lonely work that you're doing in publishing. Sixth, invest in community within the walls of your company, yes, but beyond that too. And I'll say more in a moment about the idea of rooting for rivals, of building community with people that we might think of, at least in the individualistic American context, as our rivals. Seventh, interrogate cultural currents in your part of the world, which might have some overlap with mine, but probably also have some distinctives. For example, in my case at IVP, when I was there, I watched very closely what was happening in the academy, in universities and colleges in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, because I knew that those conversations, those ideas, those movements coming out of the academy would eventually filter into popular culture, into the church. Topics like transhumanism or artificial intelligence and other issues like that began at the academic level, and eventually they filtered down. And so we needed to be ready to publish into those issues. We needed to be tracing what was happening, the currents, in order to be ready to offer a distinctively Christian voice. So interrogate cultural currents in your part of the world, which may or may not be different than mine. Eighth, practice a stewardship mindset. You are not your work, and your work is not the total sum of who you are. You have been given a company or a task or a team within the larger company to care for, to lead, to nurture, to coach, to guide. Be a steward of that. Work with the open hands and heart of a steward rather than the grasping hands of an owner. 9, this may be peculiar to me, but I'm going to offer it anyway. Give yourself permission to take time to journal, to write, to reflect as a daily or at least a regular spiritual discipline. I have filled numerous journals with questions, with observations, with the worries, the ideas, the dreams that I had for my bookstore, later for Ingram, for IVP, and now for ECPA. Over many years in this work, journaling as a spiritual discipline has been a pathway to my staying fresh, staying relevant, and staying effective as a publisher. It allows me to know what's happening in the interior life of my soul. And finally, for the leader, Be aware of what my Canadian friend and author Gordon T. Smith calls the shelf life of your leadership. A long obedience does not mean that we never seek or take a new path. After all, Eugene Peterson moved from the Bel Air Presbyterian Church in Maryland to Regent College in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. But be discerning about the junctures where new paths may need to be taken or could be taken, and involve other trusted friends as discernment partners in that process. When I was discerning whether or not to seek the ECPA presidential role more than 18 months ago, I involved 3 people in that process. People I met with regularly who posed questions and offered their perspectives and prompted me to consider my motivations and much more. They were people I trusted, people I knew would speak truth and wisdom to me in this process. And we as leaders all need others like that in our lives. So those are the 10 postures, permissions, and practices for the effective leader. What about the company? For the company, similar but distinct lists of corporate conventions, commitments, and culture markers stand out to me. First, as I mentioned earlier, root for rivals. I recognize that some of you are working in geographic areas where you may be the only Christian publisher doing this work. But for those of you where there's at least one other, or 5 or 50 or 100 publishers doing a similar work, root for them. Cheer on their work, their accomplishments, their people, their leaders. This happened in a significant way for publishers in the Chicago and Grand Rapids, Michigan area during the global health pandemic. Every Tuesday morning, beginning in mid-March of 2020 and continuing for more than a year, we gathered via Zoom and we prayed for one another. We encouraged one another. We shared advice. We told each other of developments that may be of use to the other publishers in their work. We were rivals in the sense that we were competing for the same authors and the same market share, if you will. But above and beyond that, we were sisters and brothers in Christ. The intelligence, expertise, and help that those publishers gave me contributed to my own resilience and effectiveness during a very challenging season that we all experienced. I love what Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's a historian and an author, in her book, Leadership in Turbulent Times. She says, scholars who have studied the development of leaders have situated resilience, the ability to sustain ambition in the face of frustration, at the heart of potential leadership growth. And I dare say that what we experienced in that year or more of meeting together as rival publishers deepened the resilience that we all experienced. Secondly, as leaders, it's good to build a company that has a team of rivals at the executive level. This phrase comes from a book by Goodwin, which was actually on Abraham Lincoln, the US president, who built the American system calls it a cabinet, but his executive team among a team of rivals. This element may or may not apply in your context, but for those with a defined leadership team, look for complementary gifts and perspectives. Look for unique histories among the people on that leadership team, people who have special insights or giftedness. Encourage disagreement to be aired wherever it's present. Encourage that disagreement to be considered, to be talked about. But when a decision is made, expect the team of rivals to commit and to move forward with vigor. Third, ensure that your company is willing to take risks on occasion, to be willing to fail. But fourth, ensure that the risk is survivable for the company and for the individuals who serve there. Years ago, I designed a new sales representation model at IVP. We moved away from the sales team that we had worked with for many, many years, and a group of people who were dear friends of mine. And we attempted to undertake a model where we did it on our own with staff. We undertook that new model for 18 months, and we monitored the metrics that we put in place, watching for success or failure against the metrics that I had established. When it was clear to me that my new model was not working, I humbled myself and I returned to the prior representation firm, which continues in that role for IVP and other publishers like Baker to this day. So risk, but ensure the risk is survivable for the company and the individual. As I close with some suggested resources for you to read, I will share with you the book that was foundational for me in this area, a book titled Adapt. Fifth, build and share institutional knowledge within your company. There are great books on this subject, such as Hugh Hecklow's On Thinking Institutionally and Gordon Smith's Institutional Intelligence. But the core idea is to not assume that people in your company know your company's values, knows its history, knows its mission, knows its expectation of employees. So share those things early and often with new employees, and remind long-term employees of that institutional dynamic. Update the intelligence over time as needed. Sixth, connected to institutional intelligence is this: to know the company's history, but to not be bound by it. Always be open to new ideas, new ways of accomplishing your mission. If something didn't work 20 years ago, it doesn't mean it won't work today. But it's very easy for a company history to trump innovation, experimentation, and relaunched ventures. Seventh, companies that stay fresh and relevant and effective exercise what's called portfolio management, having a range of topics and formats and levels that they are publishing in, and a range of partners who help get the word out about your books and into the marketplace. Eighth, plan and adapt well. I'll recommend a resource by Shelley Trebesh in a moment that has been the most helpful tool for me in thinking about organizational planning for publishing houses. It's important to know your purpose, your mission, important to establish a vision for your work. It's important to have a short-term strategic plan. I believe the world and publishing is changing too quickly to have a long-term strategic plan, but perhaps a 3-year strategic plan, and then set annual plans and team goals and individual goals, depending on the size of your company out of that. I did a workshop on that topic in Singapore with Sam Richardson of SPCK, and was very appreciative of what I learned from publishers in other parts of the world about the ways that they go about planning. So plan and adapt well. Ninth, communicate to your staff, to your donors if you have people who support you, and to your customers and your business partners. And finally, invest in future leaders of your organization. We will all end our work at our publishing houses at some point, just as I ended mine 1 year ago this month at IVP. So identify, train, develop, nurture the next generation leaders so the work you have been doing continues unabated. So those are the 20 elements I've identified and have experienced myself. 10 for the leader, 10 for the organization, things that roll up to remaining, or at least having the opportunity or the possibility of remaining fresh and relevant and effective as a Christian publisher. And as I looked at my own list, 3 emerging themes seem to be embedded in that. And I'd like to share those with you as I begin to draw to a close. The themes that I see and want to suggest for your reflection at your own publishing house is: first, People and companies that stay fresh, relevant, and effective are curious. They're curious about God. They're curious about others. They're curious about publishing, about the world, about books. Second, those who stay fresh and relevant and effective are adaptive as leaders and as organizations. They are not static. And third, they are connected to each other within their organization, connected to rivals with whom they root on, connected to conversations in the academy, to the arts, connected to the publishing industry through organizations like MAI and ECPA. If you as leaders practice yourself, and if you model for your organizations curiosity, adaptability, and a commitment to being connected to community, you are well on your way to achieving effectiveness in this work. And I'll leave you with this. Books can help you toward that end. I mentioned earlier that one of the foundational personal practices for effective leaders is to read widely. And though we could fill an entire webinar, and I'd love to do that one, we could fill an entire webinar with just book recommendations that we shared with each other. I've limited myself as I draw our time to a close to just 8 resources beyond the Peter Greer book that I started with. And as I mentioned in the handout, while I've tried to draw from non-American voices intentionally, I'm sure that there are authors in your specific context who have similar resources that would be helpful to your journey. But here are 8 that I highly recommend. First, In the Name of Jesus by the late Henry Nouwen is a classic in the field of spiritual leadership with applications to the church, to business, and to other contexts. It has a strong emphasis on the leader's need to pray, to cede power, and to forgive. I have returned repeatedly to this book throughout my leadership journey thus far, and I will no doubt continue to do so in the years ahead. Adapt is an instructive book on the importance of risk, adaptation, and innovation. The author counsels that those of us who lead that change do so in a way that the metrics of success or failure are known by the individuals who make up the organization, and that the organization monitors results. When we fail, Harford says, we need to fail quickly. A key takeaway for me was ensuring that failure for the organization and its individual parts is survivable. Though not written from a Christian perspective, I found it uncommonly helpful. And the author, who is from Scotland, has a TED Talk online that gets at its core principles. The TED Talk, which is about 15 minutes long, is titled Trial, Error, and the God Complex. The 5 Phases of Leadership is a book organized around 4 key themes that are a part of every leader's work: establishing trust, cultivating other leaders, discerning vision, implementing plans, and transitioning out. A lot of those themes you've even heard in my remarks today. It's published by Langham, and it's written from a distinctively Christian perspective, as you would expect. Making Room for Leadership by Mary Kate Morse is an important book on the nature of power and influence between people and within organizations, how that power and influence is wielded either effectively or harmfully. She pays special attention to dynamics between men and women in the marketplace. This is one of the most significant leadership books I've ever read, and I commend it to you. As I mentioned earlier, I am by nature a somewhat anxious person, and so one of the early challenges I received from a mentor was to practice the discipline of maintaining a non-anxious presence in my leadership. The Australian pastor Mark Sayre's recent book, A Non-Anxious Presence, published by Moody Publishers in Chicago, beautifully captures the ways this can be cultivated in the life of the leader. And though his context is the church, the application to our work in publishing is quite seamless. I'll be hosting a conversation for ECPA members with Mark Sayers via Zoom on August the 12th. Tempered Resilience is a book I was privileged to work on during my time at IVP, and Todd Bolsinger in the book uses a metaphor of being forged on an anvil, forged by heat, by blows, and it masterfully explores the ways in which we are formed or deformed in the midst of change and crisis. I've always appreciated the leadership insights of John Stott, including in this book that IVP UK published, Calling Christian Leaders. It's rooted in the book of 1 Corinthians. And though he too was writing to the church, I believe that his principles really do apply to our work in publishing, especially his ideas about power through weakness. And finally, as I undertook the tasks of personal, annual, and strategic planning at IVP in particular, no book was more helpful to me than Shelley Trebesh's Made to Flourish. Shelley is a consultant who has done significant work with businesses and ministries in several countries in Asia and in Europe, as well as North America. Her understanding of ministry and nonprofit realities, and her understanding of diverse cultural settings, and how that impacts our work as in planning for our organizations. It's the best I've encountered. And so I commend that to you as well. I conclude and move to our time of dialogue with words from the Dutch author Henry J.M. Nouwen, who said, "You are not what you do, although you do a lot. You are not what you have collected in terms of friendships and connections, although you might have many. You are not the popularity that you have received. You are not the success of your work. You are not what people say about you, whether they speak well or whether they speak poorly about you. All these things that keep you quite busy, quite occupied, and often quite preoccupied are not telling the truth about who you are. I am here to remind you," Nouwen writes, "that in the name of God, you are the beloved daughters and sons of God, and that God says to you, I have called you from all eternity, and you are engraved from all eternity in the palms of my hands. You are mine. You belong to me, and I love you with an everlasting love." Friends, ultimately, people who exercise intentionality in staying fresh, relevant, and effective as a Christian publisher will be people who take on that identity, who remind themselves and those around them that they are beloved daughters and sons of God, a God who loves them with an everlasting love. Thank you very much for being here and for your kind attention, and I'll turn things over to Ramon.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was really very insightful. An excellent presentation. Thank you. I've taken down notes myself, and I will go through your handout and presentations again. We have a question here from Sam Richardson of SPCK. He said he went through a 2-day residential based around the VIA character strength survey. And the top character for him was hope. Top character strength was hope. How might we as hopeful leaders make our hope infectious?
Yeah.
There are downsides of being highly hopeful that we might need to be aware of.
Thanks for your question, Sam. I think that there are downsides to a certain kind of hope, and that hope is hope that is manufactured, that is not arising out of a genuine place. In my background in Middle America, we would have called it a Pollyanna view of things. hope that isn't real, I think, leads to cynicism. But hope that is genuine, that is layered against times of recognition of challenge. So, at SPCK, you have let's say I hope you don't, but if you had a season of downturn in your sales, or you had a difficult situation with an author that became very public or something like that, if you layer against your natural hopefulness, kind of a very clear, candid, reality of this is a very difficult situation, and we in the first case, let's say we're going to have to trim costs, and this is what that's going to do. Or in the case of the author, we're going to have to take a book out of print because of an issue with an author. You're marrying your natural hope with a reality check, or a truthfulness of current situations. If the world is always a happy place in your workplace, then people may tune out your hope. But I know that won't be the case. So always marry the natural hopefulness alongside sharing the deeper reality when there are times of challenge. And I think that your bent in that area of hope will be a gift to SPCK.
Thank you for that answer, Jeff. Anonymous attendee asked, you mentioned being anxious. How have you learned to be a confident leader, even while acknowledging anxiety as part of the human experience?
Yeah. Thanks to whomever asked that question. One of the ways that I have dealt with the anxiety that I carry with me is to write. I mentioned journaling as a spiritual discipline, and I was suggesting on that one that you kind of, if you're applying that to your work in publishing, you're journaling kind of what are you worried about in your work, what do you hope for, what are you dreaming, being in touch with things like that. But I think for me personally, the process of journaling as a discipline, and then going back and reflecting on what I captured in those words, at a later time, kind of seeing how has God been with me in the midst of that anxiety. In the book that Ramon mentioned, The Language of the Soul, that comes out next spring, there's a whole chapter on longing for freedom from fear and anxiety. And I talk about several ways that I've been met in that. The Psalms, the reading of the Psalms is one of those ways. And I do think in the midst of the global health pandemic, the Psalms became a lifeline for me. I think that was true for others. I'm pretty sure I've been in conversations with others in publishing who said, I couldn't read a lot in those early months, but the Psalms really spoke to me. And that was my experience. So reading scripture, and for me, particularly the Psalms, where there is no emotion and no loss, no grief that the psalmists weren't in touch with. And so those are some of the things. But your question, I believe, said something about being a confident leader. That comes and goes. I think recognize that you're going to have seasons where you as a leader are confident in what you're doing, and other times where your confidence, it just kind of melts away, it goes away. And in those times, that's where being in community with other people, people who will, particularly trusted friends or mentors who can share in that with you and help, who can ask you questions and reflect back what they're hearing from you. So be in community as well. Read the Psalms, journal. Those are some of the ways that I have navigated this.
and acknowledging that your anxiety could be infectious as well if you're
it can, which is why the non-anxious presence, I listed that among my 8. It was very hard to winnow down to just 8 books, but I do think right now, with with everything that we've been through since 2020, with war in Ukraine, with the heat in Europe, I mean, with losses in Africa, just on and on, with political polarization in America, we're all feeling a lot of grief, and it would be very easy for us to be anxious people. And yes, Ramon, you transmit that to the people on your team just as easily, or perhaps easier, than you transmit hope.
Yes, thank you. Joanna Nicolas from the Philippines, could you expound on the wiseness of creating a short strat plan rather than a long one, a 3-year versus a 5 years?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and I acknowledge as I do that, in depending on what context you're in, it might be different for you, but in the US, I did 7-year strategic plans were more the norm for me throughout much of my career. And what I found, and certainly in the last decade, is that length of time, too much changes. If the strategic plan is actually going to guide your annual plans, if it's going to elevate the things that are most important for you to do next year and the year after that, having a shorter window where you can take into consideration things that have happened in the industry, things that have happened with different laws related to copyright, or all kinds of things. Design changes, formats change, all of that. I have found that 3 years is kind of the sweet spot. And then be ready, as you're in that middle year, be ready to extend it, work with your team to extend. And so you're always kind of looking at 3 years. That, I think, at least for our context in America, with the rapid rate of change, who would have known that TikTok was going to drive book sales, at least in the general, if not Christian market, even a year ago, the way that it has. So have a shorter window, but then be evaluating and extending with your team.
Thank you. Jose Carlos is asking, excellent presentation. Why do you think main Christian publishers in the US are more into producing Bible adaptations than Christian fiction regarding comic and graphic novels, even though comics' popularity in many formats are on the rise worldwide? Jose Carlos is a graphic artist, member of the board of MAI.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know why that is. The publishing house I worked for didn't really publish things like that. So I but knowing some of the people at publishing houses who are doing that, I think there is a motivation to reach younger people, reach people who might not read traditional books, but I really don't know, because that's not an area that I have direct experience with. I think most of the friends that I'm connected to in US Christian publishing, there certainly is a sales performance dimension, but there is almost without fail a ministry motivation. And if they can marry the two, have something that sells well and that has a ministry impact, that's what they do.
Thank you. Chern, hi Chern. She was at Lit World in Hungary, Jeff, any reason why you chose the Noen's quotation as the ending of your talk?
I appreciate his work, and I think that perhaps I'm speaking to myself in choosing that that word about we are not our work. I think it is a part of who we are. It is a part of what we do, but ultimately and finally, we are God's beloved. And I think at times those of us doing Christian ministry, whether it's in the church or whether it's in Christian publishing, we can confuse that. We can believe that we are our work and our work is us. A friend of mine, a musician named Michael Card, I remember many times going into his studio in Nashville when we were working on books together with a companion compact disc. And I was always struck by a wall hanging he had above his studio door. It said, "You are not your gift." And I remember asking Michael Card, tell me about that. And his mentor gave that to him because his name was Bill Lane, a theologian named William Lane. And Bill was concerned that Michael was getting things mixed up, thinking that his gift with music was who he was. And so he had this wall hanging and mounted it above his studio door. "You are not your gift." Well, in a similar way, we in Christian publishing can confuse things. And so I chose it because the quote speaks to me, but also I think that many of us in Christian ministry of one kind or another can confuse that. So I hope it was an encouragement to you.
And a very good reminder, because we can easily, our sense of identity is what we do, and we sort of wait for the praise and congratulatory messages from friends, but actually our identity is in Christ indeed. Thank you. Anonymous attendee, thank you for your talk. I feel my soul is fed. Thank you. Anonymous again, would a roller coaster disillusionment at work be a sign of the coming end of your shelf life, even if you know that you contribute greatly to the company's growth?
Yes, it could be. It might not be. And so have a check of that with, you recall I mentioned at some point in the remarks, gather up trusted friends. If you have a mentor, a spiritual director, or as I did, a group of 3 friends. In my case, we didn't meet, the 4 of us did not meet together. I met individually with each of those 3 people. They all knew of the other, but we did not meet together. In my case, in making the move that I did, it was less a roller coaster disillusionment than it was a sense of call to ECPA. But I do believe what you are identifying, a repeated, presence of disillusionment, of being, taken back to that fork in the road of that graphic, and having to choose between the inward and the upward. It would, at a minimum, it would be something to be attentive to, but I wouldn't necessarily assume that it is indicative of your shelf life coming to an expiration date, if you will.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I also would like to thank our attendees, our viewers, our audience for your interaction, your questions. Thank you for engaging with Jeff and the topic. So Jeff, we would like to ask you for your parting words of encouragement to our audience. Some words of encouragement.
Sure. Well, I'll begin my parting words again. Ramon, thank you for having me and for allowing me to do what I had prepared for Hungary and was unable to to bring there. Friends, the work that you are doing in Christian publishing, and I know there's at least one writer as well who registered, it is very, very important work. It's true that you are not your work, but this work is meaningful in the world, whatever part of the world that you're in. And to remain effective does require intentionality. And so my hope is that some of the practices that I have shared with you out of my own journey might be of help to you. And I would welcome the chance to connect with any of you. My email was on that last slide, jcrosby@ecpa.org. But I know you're also in good hands with your MAI community. So continue to stay connected to John or Ramon and MAI. You're doing good work. It's difficult work, but God is in the midst of it. And it is worth doing in the midst of whatever challenges you're facing. So God bless you in that.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Oh, we have one more question here. Would you be willing to answer this?
Sure.
Yeah, Joanna is asking, how could Christian publishers brace against customers' volatile demands and the current rabid cancel culture?
Oh my goodness, that's a challenging one here at the end, but a great question, Joanna. I think that it's hard to know what part of the country that you're in, so I can only speak for the U.S. But perhaps things have happened before or will happen later in other parts of the world. I think we all need to be courageous, and we need to expect that Christian content in the U.S. and in other parts of the world, certainly, maybe for different reasons, that it will continue to be challenged, probably in increasing ways. And so I would strongly encourage you to look for a variety of partners through whom you can have your books, your resources available. I would encourage you, if you've not already done so, to develop direct to consumer work in your publishing house, where you have direct access to them. It's difficult work. It's slow work. You wouldn't begin that and all of a sudden have tremendous sales. But if you're not already doing so, you might wish to establish direct to consumer links and pour some investment into that if you're able to do so. But that is a massive topic that perhaps MAI could help with on another webinar, because it really would take some thought and some contextualization for different markets, where in some places it's the government that is squelching things, and in others it's a major technology company. And so but the question that you're raising and the issue is very real, and you're not alone in it.
Yeah, and it would take really intentional addressing these issues on a individual basis, as you said, if you could answer them directly. Yeah, and it will require time and effort on your part to be able to do that. But at the same time, acknowledging that it's real, and the culture nowadays is that people seem to be open and being very forceful in their views. But we have the hope, and thank God that our message of hope through the gospel would prevail eventually. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you again for being with us today as our speaker. Thank you so much, everyone. for being here and your questions and engaging our Jeff and the topic. We would like to invite you for our next free MAI webinar. It will be on digital marketing through social media and direct email, to be led by Gladys Calalang and Ida Torres of OMF Literature in the Philippines. That will be on August 16th. And we will be sending out invitations to all of our contacts around the world. So thank you again. And Jeff, thank you. God bless you. And God bless
you.
everyone.
Goodbye now.
Bye for now.